Have you ever noticed how some people seem to move through life with ease, as if their hearts weigh nothing at all? And yet, for others, every step feels like a struggle, as if invisible weights are chained to their souls. Most of us don't realize it, but we're carrying something heavy, a burden that isn't strapped to our backs but to our minds, memories, regrets, old wounds we've never allowed to heal, guilt over things we can't change, and bitterness over moments that have long since slipped through our fingers. It's like walking through a vast desert with a bag over your shoulder. Each mistake, each betrayal, each heartbreak is another rock you toss inside. At first, you barely notice the weight. A pebble here, a stone there. You tell yourself, it's nothing, I can carry this. But over time, the bag gets heavier. You hunch your shoulders, your steps slow. The world around you becomes a blur because your eyes are fixed on the ground, too focused on what you're carrying to notice the sky above. And here's the thing, no one else can see this bag. It's yours alone. And yet its weight colors every conversation you have, every relationship you build, every decision you make. It shapes the way you see yourself and the way you believe the world sees you. We often think it's the circumstances of life that exhaust us. The job, the bills, the deadlines. But the truth is, it's the unresolved past we drag behind us that wears us down the most. The moments we replay over and over. The what-ifs and if-onlys. In the teachings of Buddhism, this is called attachment, clinging to things long gone, holding on to pain as if it defines us. The Buddha spoke often of the danger of carrying what no longer serves us. He taught that peace isn't found by adding more to our lives, but by releasing what weighs us down. There's an old story about a traveler crossing a wide river. He builds a sturdy raft to get across. When he reaches the other side, instead of leaving the raft by the shore, he hoists it onto his back and continues his journey into the mountains. Every step becomes harder, every hill more punishing because of the raft on his shoulders. Most of us live like that traveler. We build tools, coping mechanisms, beliefs, and grudges to survive certain moments. But when those moments pass, we refuse to let them go. We carry the raft long after the river is behind us. Imagine what your life would feel like without the weight of yesterday's mistakes. What if you could wake up tomorrow without dragging around stories of who hurt you, who left you, who disappointed you? What if you didn't have to define yourself by old scars? There's a kind of freedom in that thought, isn't there? A lightness. And yet, so many of us resist it. Not because we enjoy suffering, but because in some strange way, our pain has become familiar. It's like an old coat, tattered and heavy, but we know its weight. To leave it behind feels like stepping into the unknown. But what if the unknown is an emptiness? What if it's space? Space for joy, for peace, for the simple pleasure of being alive without 1,000 old voices whispering in your ear. This isn't about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about learning to hold it differently. About acknowledging what was, feeling it fully, and then setting it down by the roadside. Not because you're heartless, but because you're finally brave enough to walk unburdened. You don't need to carry the stones forever. And so, as we begin this journey together, a journey of living lightly, I invite you to notice your own invisible bag. What's in it? Whose voices are echoing there? Which moments do you replay when no one's watching? Take a deep breath. You've been carrying them for so long, it's easy to forget they're even there. But what if, just what if, you could lay them down right here, right now, and take one single step forward, lighter than you've felt in years? The path ahead is waiting, and so are you. Have you ever wondered why we hold on to things that hurt us? Why, even when a memory brings nothing but pain, we still clutch it tightly, like a sharp shard of glass pressed against our skin, refusing to let go? It's one of the strangest parts of being human. We carry old betrayals, words spoken in anger, moments when someone left or when we let ourselves down. Even when we tell ourselves, I've moved on, somewhere deep inside, a part of us keeps replaying the story. But why? Buddhist philosophy offers a profound answer. It begins with a single word, attachment. You see, suffering doesn't arise from pain alone. Pain is inevitable: loss, disappointment, illness, aging. These things come to all of us, as certain as the setting sun. But suffering is born from our refusal to accept those pains, from the way we cling to what should have been, or what we desperately wish could still be. There's a concept the Buddha often spoke of, T, a letter 1E47H a macron, which means craving or thirst. It's the endless reaching for things to be different, for pleasure to last forever, for pain to disappear instantly, for life to follow the script we've written in our minds. When reality refuses to cooperate, we suffer. Imagine holding a rope and someone on the other end is pulling it hard, creating friction against your skin. The tighter you grip, the deeper it cuts. And yet most of us don't let go. We pull harder. We tell ourselves, if I just hold on a little longer, maybe I can fix it. Maybe I can undo it. But the truth is, no matter how tightly you cling, the past won't change. Words won't unsay themselves. People won't become who you wish they were. And yet, letting go feels impossible because to release the rope feels like surrender. It feels like defeat. In reality, it's freedom. We hold on because we fear emptiness. Because even pain feels more certain than the unknown. That ache in your chest from a lost love, that bitterness from an old betrayal, it becomes a kind of identity, a story you know by heart. And somewhere along the line, you start believing that without it, you wouldn't recognize yourself. But you would. You were someone before the pain arrived, and you'll still be someone after it leaves. The Buddha taught that suffering is like two arrows. The first arrow is the inevitable pain of life, loss, illness, aging, death. The second arrow is the one we fire into ourselves, over and over through our thoughts, our resistance, our refusal to let things be as they are. And it's this second arrow that creates most of our suffering. We hold on because we believe our stories are permanent. But like clouds drifting across a sky, every emotion, every memory, every heartbreak is temporary. It rises, it passes, it dissolves. The only thing that keeps it alive is the grip of our own hands. There's an ancient parable about a man who fell into a deep pit. At the bottom, he finds an old, rusted chain. Desperate, he clings to it, believing it's his only lifeline. He doesn't realize the chain is attached to nothing, that if he'd only let go, he could climb the walls of the pit with his bare hands. But his belief in the chain's power keeps him trapped. So many of us live like that, gripping tightly to beliefs, grudges, fears, and stories that have long since stopped serving us. Not because they protect us, but because we're too afraid to discover what lies beyond them. But what lies beyond is not a void. It's not loneliness. It's peace. The journey to living lightly begins with recognizing the roots of our suffering. It's about seeing how often we choose the second arrow, how often we tighten the rope instead of releasing it. And it starts with a question most of us rarely ask. What am I still holding on to, and why? Is it the memory of a time you felt unloved? A mistake you can't forgive yourself for? A dream that never came true? The words someone said to you years ago that you still hear in your mind when you lie awake at night? These invisible chains weigh more than we realize. But here's the truth, they only exist because we choose to hold them. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to loosen your grip. As we continue walking this path together, we'll begin to understand how these attachments form and, more importantly, how to release them. Not by forcing ourselves to forget, but by changing the way we hold our stories. By honoring the past without letting it command the future. There's a gentleness to this kind of freedom. It doesn't demand. It doesn't punish. It simply waits for the moment you're ready. And somewhere inside you, I promise, that moment is coming. There's a quiet lie we tell ourselves every day, that the world and the people in it will stay as they are. That the friendships we cherish will always feel this warm. That the places we love will always be there. That the person we see in the mirror will remain unchanged. We cling to this illusion of permanence like a lifeboat in a restless ocean. And yet, nothing has ever truly stayed the same. Look back for a moment. Not too far, just a few years. Think about where you lived, the people you surrounded yourself with, the things that used to keep you awake at night. How many of those still exist in the same form now? How many of those faces are still close? How many of those problems still matter? It's strange, isn't it? How easily we forget that change isn't a disruption to life, it's the nature of life itself. In Buddhist philosophy, there's a powerful teaching called anicca, the principle of impermanence. It tells us that everything, every thought, every feeling, every relationship, every breath is in a constant state of becoming something else. And when you really see this, not just with your eyes but with your whole being, it changes everything. That heartbreak you thought you'd never recover from, it softened, it faded. That joy you believed would last forever, it too transformed. We live in a world of continuous birth and death, not just in the literal sense but in every passing moment. A version of you existed when you started this sentence, and now it's gone. But here's the strange part. Even knowing this, we resist, we cling. We try to freeze time in our hands, to keep people from changing, to hold on to feelings, to trap beautiful moments in the amber of memory. Why? Because we believe permanence equals safety. If this friendship stays the same, I won't be lonely. If my health never declines, I won't be afraid. If this happiness remains untouched, I won't have to face emptiness. But the truth is, the tighter we grasp, the more life slips through our fingers. Have you ever tried holding water in your palm? The harder you squeeze, the faster it escapes. And life is no different. It isn't meant to be caged or preserved. It's meant to be witnessed, savored, and then released. The Buddha compared life to a river, always moving, never still. You can step into the same river twice, but it won't be the same water, and you won't be the same person. The mistake we make is believing that change is something to fear, when in reality, it's the very thing that makes life precious. Imagine if nothing changed. If people stayed frozen in the exact versions you first met them in. If every sunrise looked identical, if no song ever surprised you, the magic would vanish. Growth would disappear. Loss, yes, but also discovery and healing and wonder. The ache you feel when something beautiful ends is the proof that it mattered. And in the emptiness it leaves behind, space is made for something new to rise. You see, when we accept impermanence, suffering softens. It's not that pain disappears. It's that it loses its power to define you. When a relationship fades, you understand it was never yours to keep. When a moment of happiness passes, you're grateful it visited at all. When life changes, as it always will, you don't fight it. You flow with it. There's a quiet kind of courage in this way of living. A freedom in no longer demanding that life fit your script. A lightness that comes when you stop treating the world like something that owes you consistency. And when you start seeing every moment as a visitor, some stay briefly, some linger a little longer, you learn to bow to each, without trying to chain them to your side. That's what it means to live lightly, to feel the fullness of love without needing to own it, to embrace the rise and fall of your own emotions, knowing none of them define your true self, to honor each chapter of your life as it arrives and as it leaves. So, as you walk through this day, notice the small changes happening all around you. The way the light shifts in a room, the way your breath moves differently when you're calm versus when you're restless, the way a stranger's kindness can soften your heart in an instant. These are not trivial. They're reminders that nothing is permanent. And in that impermanence, there's extraordinary beauty. We'll explore in the next turn of this path how these old memories and stories we carry shape our present, even long after the moment has passed. And maybe how we might finally learn to set them down. But for now, take a breath. Let what needs to stay, stay. Let what's ready to go, go. It's already changing anyway. There's a weight most of us carry, even if we pretend we don't. A silent, invisible burden we drag through our days, tucked neatly behind our smiles and polite conversations. It's the sting of old betrayals, the ache of words that cut too deep, the memory of people who left and those who stayed but wounded us anyway. And no matter how much time passes, some wounds linger. They live in our bodies as tension, in our minds as restless thoughts, in our hearts as the quiet ache of unfinished stories. We tell ourselves we've moved on, that it doesn't matter anymore. But some nights when the world grows quiet, those ghosts return. A face, a sentence, a regret, and it hurts. It's easy to believe that time alone heals these wounds, but time can only bury them. It takes something deeper to truly set us free. That something is forgiveness. Now I know even the word can feel heavy, because forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood ideas in our culture. We imagine it means excusing the inexcusable, pretending the pain never happened, letting people off the hook. But that's not what true forgiveness is. In Buddhist philosophy, forgiveness isn't about them. It's about you, about no longer allowing past pain to poison your present life. It's about choosing, moment by moment, to stop carrying the weight of someone else's actions. Because here's the truth we rarely admit. Holding on to anger, resentment, and blame is a form of self-imprisonment. It's drinking poison and hoping the other person suffers. And in the end, it's your peace that's stolen. The Buddha once said, "Holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned." And isn't that what we do? We replay the old story. We fuel the old anger. We keep the wound alive. Not because we want to suffer, but because we believe it protects us. If we stay angry, maybe it won't happen again. If we never forgive, we won't be vulnerable. If we build walls, no one can get in to hurt us. But those walls don't just keep others out, they keep your own light trapped inside. And so, the work of forgiveness is not a gift to them. It's a liberation for you. It means finally putting down the burden you were never meant to carry for this long. Now, let's be honest. Forgiveness isn't a single decision. It's a practice. Some days you might feel a wave of peace. Other days the bitterness returns. That's okay. The important thing is choosing, again and again, not to let it harden your heart. One of the most beautiful practices in Buddhism is metta bhavana, the cultivation of loving kindness. It begins by offering compassion to yourself, then to those you love, then to neutral people, and eventually to those who have harmed you, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve to live free from their shadow. You start by simply wishing them well in your heart, even if you don't fully mean it yet. May you be safe, may you find peace, may you be free from suffering. And with time, something remarkable happens. The grip loosens, the story softens, and your heart grows lighter. Forgiveness also means forgiving yourself, for the times you stayed too long, for the words you wish you could take back, for the person you couldn't be. We carry so much guilt for the ways we've stumbled through this human life. But you were doing the best you could with what you knew, with the heart you had. Let that be enough. When we begin to forgive truly, deeply, we reclaim our peace, not by erasing the past, but by no longer allowing it to own us. Imagine, for a moment, what it would feel like to set those old wounds down, to stop needing revenge in the form of silence, coldness, or distance, to no longer be defined by the people who couldn't love you properly. What would your days feel like? How would your heart move in the world? This is the power of forgiveness. It's the doorway to freedom you never knew you had the key to. And as you step through it, you make space for something beautiful to take root in its place: peace, lightness, and a quiet joy that can't be shaken by the storms of the past. Because life is too short to live inside old wounds. And the truth is, you were always meant to be free. So as we leave this chapter behind, carry this thought with you. The past can only hold you if you keep holding it. And the next step on this journey is learning how to let go, not just of pain, but of the illusions and expectations that keep us trapped in old stories. Because once you understand the nature of attachment, everything changes. But we'll get to that soon. For now, take a breath. Forgive not because they deserve it, but because you do. Pause for a moment, not tomorrow, not next week. Not when you get that promotion, find that person, or finally fix everything you think is broken. Right here, right now, this breath, this is life. And yet, how rarely we actually live it. Most of us spend our days chasing ghosts of what was, or shadows of what might be. We relive old conversations, replay regrets, rewrite what we should have said. Or we lean into the future, imagining happiness waiting just beyond some invisible line we never quite reach. I'll be content when. I'll slow down when. I'll be happy if. And in the meantime, life slips quietly through our fingers. It's one of the greatest paradoxes of being human. We long for peace, we crave presence, and yet we make our homes in the past and future two places that, if we're honest, don't even exist. The past, it's a memory. A story our mind retells, colored by emotion and selective recall. The future, it's imagination, a projection built on guesses, hopes, and fears. And what do both have in common? They aren't here. The only place life actually unfolds is in this very moment. The Buddha spoke of this with beautiful simplicity. Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment. Because this fleeting now is the only doorway to true peace. And yet, we resist it. Why? Because being fully present means letting go of control. It means facing life without the shield of distraction. It asks us to meet ourselves, our raw, unfiltered, unguarded selves exactly as we are. And that can be terrifying. We've built habits of busyness to avoid it. We scroll, binge, plan, overthink. Anything but sit quietly with ourselves in the space between breaths. But what if that space is where your peace lives? You see, when we anchor ourselves in the now, something subtle but powerful happens. The weight of old wounds lightens. The anxiety of what might be softens. And for the first time in a long time, we simply are. Not the version of ourselves we perform for the world. Not the self we were 5 years ago, or the one we hope to be. Just the person who is breathing, feeling, existing here. The Japanese Zen tradition has a word for this, ikigo iki. It means one time, one meeting. A reminder that every moment we live is unique, unrepeatable, and sacred in its own way. This conversation you're having, that sunset you barely noticed, the scent of rain on concrete, the laugh of a friend you haven't heard in too long. These tiny, ordinary fragments are where life actually happens. And when you start to notice them, truly notice them, the world transforms. Not because anything outside changes, but because your relationship to it does. You realize that happiness isn't some grand event waiting at the end of a long road. It's here in a sip of tea, in the warmth of sunlight on your skin, in a breath that carries no expectation. And you begin to understand what Buddhist teachings have always whispered. Presence is freedom. Freedom from regret. Freedom from fear. Freedom from the stories you've been telling yourself about what your life should be. Because when you're fully present, you don't need to rewrite the past. You don't need to obsess over the future. You just live. And in that simplicity, peace blooms. Of course, it's not easy. The mind will resist. It will pull you back to old wounds or forward to imagined futures. That's what minds do. But each time you notice and gently bring yourself back to the now, to this breath, this sound, this feeling, you reclaim your life from the fog. Meditation is one of the simplest, yet most powerful tools for this. Not because it's trendy, not because it's spiritual, but because it trains you to witness your thoughts without drowning in them. To notice the pull of memory and fantasy and softly return to presence. And over time, those small moments of awareness weave together, until one day you realize you've spent more time here than lost in there. That's how transformation happens, not through grand epiphanies, but in the quiet decision to be awake to your life as it unfolds. Because when you truly live in the present, you stop chasing peace and start experiencing it. And perhaps most beautifully of all, you realize you've had it all along. So the next time your mind drifts to old stories or future worries, pause, feel your breath, look around. Notice the color of the sky, the rhythm of your heart, the quiet hum of being alive. Because this is your life, and it's happening now. As we journey forward, you'll see how this practice of presence isn't just a tool for peace. It's the foundation for living lightly, for shedding attachments, and for waking up to the breathtaking simplicity of existence. But for now, breathe. You're already home. So here we are. We've spoken of invisible burdens. We've unmasked the illusion of permanence. We've touched the quiet strength of forgiveness, and we've begun to wake up to the miracle of this very moment. But you might be wondering how. How do we take these insights from fleeting thoughts and turn them into living, breathing practices? How do we weave them into the ordinary fabric of our lives so that peace isn't a concept, but a felt experience? That's what this chapter is for. You see, Buddhism was never meant to be a distant philosophy. It's not a theory to debate or a riddle to solve. It's a living wisdom, one you carry in your breath, your words, your choices. And it offers us a quiet, powerful toolkit for doing just that. Let's open it together. One mindful breathing, the anchor to now. It sounds too simple, doesn't it? But that's its genius. Your breath is always here, always honest. It can't exist in the past. It won't wait in the future. It belongs to now. The Buddha taught anapanasati, awareness of breathing, as a doorway to presence. Not to control it, not to force it, just to notice. Feel the coolness as it enters your nose, the slight warmth as it leaves, the gentle rise and fall of your chest. Each breath is a soft reminder, this moment is enough. And when your mind wanders, because it will, gently guide it back. Again and again, not as a discipline but as an act of tenderness. Walking meditation, turning each step into a prayer. Not every meditation happens on a cushion. Sometimes the most profound awareness comes while moving. As you walk, slow your pace just a little. Feel the contact of your foot with the earth. Notice the shift of weight, the rhythm of your body. With each step, silently whisper, "I have arrived." And then, "I am home." Because you have, and you are. The path beneath you, the sky above, the air against your skin, these are not obstacles to mindfulness. They are its invitation. 3 letting go rituals, release through intention. Our minds hold on tightly, to grief, to anger, to old versions of ourselves. And sometimes we need a way to let them go. In Buddhist tradition, fire ceremonies are a beautiful symbol of release. Write down what weighs on you, regrets, fears, attachments. Then, with intention, burn the paper. Watch the smoke rise. Feel the lightness as what was becomes ash. Or if fire feels too bold, find water. Whisper your burdens into a river, a stream, even a bowl. Then let them flow away. It isn't magic, it's permission. And sometimes that's all we need. 4. Cultivating compassion, the soft strength. Compassion is not pity. It's not weakness. It's seeing the pain in others and remembering, I too have suffered. The practice of metta bhavana, or loving-kindness meditation, invites us to wish well-being for all beings. Start with yourself. May I be safe. May I be happy. May I be at ease. Then extend it outward, to loved ones, to strangers, even to those you struggle with, not because it excuses harm, but because it frees you from hatred's grip. A heart weighed down by anger cannot fly. 5. Simplifying life, the art of enough. Buddhist monks take vows of simplicity not because possessions are evil, but because excess is heavy. You don't need to renounce the world to lighten your load. Begin small, declutter a corner of your home. Release clothes you haven't worn in years. Say no to commitments that drain you. Notice how space feels. Notice how lightness tastes. This isn't asceticism, it's clarity. When you own less, you have more room for what matters. 6. Daily gratitude, shifting the gaze. Suffering often comes from wanting life to be other than it is. Gratitude isn't denying hardship. It's remembering that within the ache there is still light. Each evening, name 3 things you're thankful for: a smile, a kindness, a moment of quiet, not because life is perfect, but because gratitude softens the sharp edges. And with practice, you'll find beauty in the most ordinary places. 7. Embracing impermanence, gentle goodbyes. Nothing stays, not joy, not sorrow, not even you as you are right now, and that's okay. When we stop fighting change, we begin to dance with it. Notice the seasons turning, the lines on your face, the way a sunset slips into dusk. Each is a soft lesson, this too shall pass, and in that passing there's peace. This is your toolkit, not to master overnight, not to wear like armor, but to pick up gently when the world feels heavy. Some days you'll forget, some days you'll resist, but each time you return to these practices, you step a little lighter. And the more you live this way, the more you realize life was never meant to be carried so heavily. It was meant to be experienced, breath by breath, step by step, lightly. And now, as our journey comes full circle, let's gather what we've uncovered, the wisdom, the weight we've shed, the tools we've gathered, and gently close this chapter. Not as an ending, but as a beginning. Here we stand, at the edge of something beautiful, a freedom not found in distant places or lofty goals, but here in the simplicity of now. The past, with all its shadows, no longer weighs us down. The future, with all its uncertainties, no longer steals our peace, because we have discovered something priceless. Life only unfolds in this very moment. And this moment, right here, right now, is the gateway to living lightly. It is a freedom that whispers gently in the silence between breaths, a peace that blooms when we stop struggling and start simply being. Remember, living lightly does not mean life is without challenges. It means carrying them with grace, not burden. It means forgiving what no longer serves us, and embracing impermanence as a faithful companion. It means finding joy not in accumulation, but in release. And most of all, it means returning again and again to the present moment, because this moment is all we truly have. You have within you the power to choose lightness over heaviness, peace over turmoil, presence over distraction. And every small step you take toward this way of being creates ripples, not just in your life, but in the world around you. So I invite you to take this freedom with you. Carry it gently in your heart as you move through your days. And if this journey has touched something in you, if these words have sparked a light, please join this community. Subscribe, share, and connect, because walking the path together makes the light shine brighter. Your story, your presence, your voice matters. Thank you for sharing this space of reflection and awakening. May you live lightly, love deeply, and walk your path with a heart unburdened. Until next time, may peace be your constant companion.